Michael Parker was not born a killer. Growing up in the harsh streets of Phoenix, Arizona, he quickly learned that survival was a privilege, not a right. Mornings were filled with the sound of sirens and muffled cries bleeding through the thin walls of his crumbling home. His mother, Linda, was locked in a losing battle with her addictions. As for his father, just a shadow in distant memories, someone who disappeared before Michael could even form words. In their impoverished neighborhood, the streets were a cruel teacher, and bad choices were an ever-present temptation. By the age of 12, Michael had become adept at avoiding trouble, but his small stature and quiet demeanor made him an easy target for the dangers lurking around every corner. He was a wiry boy with piercing eyes, his silence masking a mind constantly calculating escape routes and outcomes. This very silence caught the attention of Richard Klein, a man whose charisma was magnetic, but whose gaze carried an ominous weight. Richard wasn't just any man from the neighborhood. He was a skilled recruiter, always on the hunt for desperate young lives to mold into weapons. And Michael, with his worn clothes and hardened eyes, fit the profile perfectly. "Michael," Richard said during a chance encounter outside a run-down convenience store. His voice was smooth, almost paternal. "You deserve better than this. More than this life that offers you no choices." The promise of stability and money, a way to pull his mother out of her misery, was irresistible to a boy who could see no future ahead. By 18, Michael had accepted Richard's offer. Joining his operation meant respect, power, and a means to escape his bleak reality. But what he didn't understand was that, in exchange, he'd forfeit his freedom. The training was merciless, designed to strip away fear, hesitation, and morality. Michael learned hand-to-hand combat, sharpshooting, and tactical infiltration. Every grueling session came with a mantra he was taught to embrace: the mission above all else. It wasn't long before Michael earned a reputation within the organization. Under the code name Spectre, he completed assignments with surgical precision. Targets fell without hesitation, their fates sealed by orders that left no room for questions or remorse. Richard watched with pride, his expression that of a sculptor admiring his masterpiece. But one mission would forever change Michael. The target was a deserter, a seemingly straightforward task, until Michael saw the name on the file: Jason. Jason was not just anyone. He was Michael's childhood friend, someone who had also been ensnared by Richard's web. Jason wanted out. He craved freedom, something Michael had long stopped dreaming of. To Richard, however, desertion was betrayal, punishable only by death. "It's him or you," Richard declared coldly, handing Michael the file. Michael tracked Jason to a dimly lit alley in a forgotten corner of Las Vegas. Jason's tearful pleas echoed off the graffitied walls. "You don't have to do this, Mike. We were like brothers." For a moment, the weight of his words hung in the air. But that moment ended with the deafening crack of a gunshot. The nights that followed were filled with torment. The image of Jason's face, pleading, terrified, was seared into Michael's mind. Guilt took root, growing deeper with every breath. He began questioning the choices that led him to this point. During lonely nights in Vegas, he started plotting his escape. Asking to leave wasn't an option. It would be a death sentence. But the thought of continuing in Richard's service was unbearable. One evening, drowning in despair, Michael confronted Richard. "I want out," he said, his voice steady but his heart racing. Richard's response was a chilling laugh. "No one leaves me, Michael. You know that. You're not a free man." Those words sealed his resolve. During a carefully orchestrated operation, Michael faked his own death. A calculated explosion provided the perfect cover, leaving behind just enough evidence to convince Richard of his demise. Disappearing without a trace, Michael shed his weapons, his code name, and the identity Richard had forced upon him. He found refuge in the quiet expanses of Texas, settling in a small town where anonymity was his only armor. Taking a job at a country gear store called Texas Pride, Michael built a life far removed from the chaos he left behind. To the customers and staff, he was simply Michael, the quiet, helpful store clerk with an uncanny knack for finding the perfect boots and hats for rodeo enthusiasts. Jessica, the store manager, was the heart of the business. Warm and perceptive, she noticed the layers of mystery surrounding Michael. But she respected his boundaries, appreciating the dedication he brought to his work. Still, the scars of his past ran deep. At night, Michael wrestled with demons that refused to let him rest. The sound of gunfire and the weight of Jason's last words haunted his dreams. His days in Texas were peaceful, but his nights were plagued by paranoia. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, acutely aware that Richard never left loose ends. He couldn't shake the feeling that his past was catching up to him. One day, as he assisted a young customer in choosing a hat for an upcoming rodeo, Michael noticed something unsettling: a man standing across the street, watching the store too intently. His pulse quickened, though he kept his composure. As the man disappeared into the crowd, Michael's unease grew. That night, he scouted the neighborhood, searching for any sign of a tail. The streets seemed quiet, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Back at his small, sparsely furnished home, Michael retrieved a rifle he kept hidden under the floorboards. As he cleaned it, he caught his reflection in a cracked mirror. The man staring back at him looked weary, longing for peace but bracing for battle. He knew the illusion of safety wouldn't last. The life he thought he had left behind was closing in, and Michael Parker, the man who had tried to bury Spectre, was running out of time. Michael Parker had built a quiet life in Dallas, Texas. Working at Texas Pride, a country gear store, he had found something unexpected: a sense of belonging. His days were filled with the hum of customers chatting about rodeos and ranch life, a stark contrast to the violence and betrayal of his past. Though his co-workers only knew him as Michael, the reserved but kind-hearted clerk, shadows of his old life loomed in the corners of his mind. Jessica, the store's manager, was the linchpin of the team. Her charisma and dedication kept the store thriving, and her easy smile often lightened the atmosphere. She saw potential in Michael, often assigning him more responsibility despite his attempts to remain inconspicuous. Jessica's belief in him was one of the few lights in his life, though Michael always kept her at arm's length. Among the regulars was Jack Thompson, a police officer with a love for rodeos. Jack had an eye for detail and often engaged Michael in banter, oblivious to the man's dark secrets. To Jack, Michael was a curious enigma, a man whose quiet strength seemed incongruent with his humble job. But Michael's fragile peace shattered one unassuming afternoon. The bell above the store's door jingled as a tall figure entered. Michael's eyes immediately froze on the man's face: Richard Klein. The years had barely touched him, his polished demeanor as commanding as ever. Richard's cold smile sent a chill down Michael's spine. "Spectre," Richard said softly, using the code name Michael had tried so hard to bury. "You didn't think you could just vanish, did you?" Michael's stomach churned, but he forced his expression into one of polite indifference. "Can I help you find something?" he replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside. Richard leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Oh, I've already found what I need." He casually mentioned Jessica by name, letting Michael know he had been watching. It'd be a shame if anything happened to her. The threat was unmistakable. Michael's hands clenched under the counter as Richard turned and left, the bell jingling again as the door closed behind him. The store seemed unbearably quiet, the lively chatter of moments before replaced by a suffocating silence. That night, Michael found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of Jessica's car. "I know where she lives." Fear and anger surged through him. He couldn't let Jessica become collateral damage. He doubled his efforts to protect her without raising suspicion, staying late to watch over the store and walking her to her car under the guise of politeness. But Richard's men began to make their presence known. Strangers loitered around the store, intimidating customers and silently taunting Michael. The message was clear: Richard was done waiting. Jack was the first to notice Michael's growing unease. "Something's off with you, man," Jack said one evening, leaning against the counter as Michael sorted inventory. "You've been on edge. If there's something I need to know, now's the time." Michael hesitated. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but Jack's instincts were sharp, and the man's persistence was unwavering. "There's someone who shouldn't be here," Michael finally admitted. "And I need your help to make sure he doesn't stay." Though Michael's explanation was vague, Jack's instincts told him the situation was serious. He began discreetly observing the strangers around the store, sensing an undercurrent of danger he couldn't yet identify. The tension reached a breaking point when Jessica came home one evening to find her house ransacked. She called Michael in a panic, her voice trembling over the phone. "I don't know who would do this," she said. "Nothing stolen, but it feels like a warning." Michael's grip tightened around the phone. Richard was playing his usual games, breaking people mentally before striking physically. Jessica deserved better than to be caught in this web. He assured her it was likely nothing and offered to help repair the damage, but inside, he was seething. The next morning, Michael knew he couldn't run anymore. Richard wouldn't stop until he had Michael back under his thumb, or dead. After closing the store, he met Jack at a nearby diner. Over coffee, Michael revealed a fraction of the truth. "The man causing this, he's someone I used to work for. He doesn't let people leave, and now he's here to remind me of that." Jack's brows furrowed. "And you think he's targeting Jessica to get to you?" "I don't think." "I know," Michael said, his voice heavy. "He's already made it clear." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying Michael. "You've got skills, don't you? The kind that aren't learned selling cowboy boots." Michael didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Jack sighed. "All right. You're in deep, but I'll help. Just don't make me regret this." That night, as Michael cleaned his old rifle once more, he stared at the worn stock. His reflection in the polished barrel showed a man caught between two lives, the peaceful clerk and the killer forged by Richard. He couldn't let the latter define him anymore. But to protect Jessica and himself, he'd need to summon the specter he once was. The phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Richard, accompanied by a picture of Jessica, taken earlier that day. "Time's running out." Michael's jaw clenched. He had no choice but to confront Richard directly. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back control. With Jack's growing involvement and Jessica unknowingly at the center of it all, Michael prepared for a fight that could either free him or drag him back into the abyss he had fought so hard to escape. The game had begun, and Michael knew one thing. In Richard's world, there were no rules. Michael Parker sat in the dim light of his living room, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. The text from Richard, accompanied by the photo of Jessica, had shattered any illusions of safety. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping for the past to fade. It was time to act. Jack Thompson arrived at Michael's house later that night, the tension between them thick. Jack had agreed to help, but the cracks in Michael's facade were becoming impossible to ignore. "All right, Michael," Jack said as he settled into a chair. "You've told me enough to know this isn't just some petty criminal. If we're going to stop him, I need the whole truth." Michael hesitated, his gaze fixed on the rifle he had been cleaning. "He's not a petty criminal," he admitted finally. "Richard is a man who builds soldiers, killers. He took me in when I had nothing, molded me into someone I don't want to be anymore. But no one leaves him. No one escapes. Jack let out a slow whistle, his expression a mix of disbelief and concern. And you're one of those soldiers? I was, Michael said sharply. Not anymore. Jack leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What's the plan then? Because I don't think this guy is going to back off with a polite conversation. Michael unfolded a map of Dallas on the table. Over the past week, Jack had used his police contacts to trace Richard's movements. They discovered that Richard wasn't just after Michael. He was setting up a local network, recruiting criminals and creating a base of operations. He's meeting with local thugs to expand his influence, Jack said, pointing to a warehouse on the edge of the city. If we can disrupt that, we might buy ourselves some time. Michael nodded, his mind already calculating the risks. If we hit them hard enough, it'll send a message. But we can't do this quietly. We need to make sure Richard knows I'm not afraid of him. The plan was simple but dangerous. Confront Richard's men and dismantle their operation before it could fully take root. Jack insisted on coming, despite Michael's warnings. You're not doing this alone, Jack said firmly. Besides, you'll need someone to keep an eye on your back. The following evening, the two men arrived at the warehouse. The structure was old, its windows shattered and its walls scarred with graffiti. Inside, the sound of voices and the faint clink of bottles echoed. Michael and Jack crouched behind a stack of crates, surveying the scene. Richard's men, about a dozen, were scattered throughout the space, some laughing, others examining crates of stolen goods. Michael's focus sharpened as he spotted the two ringleaders near the center, heavily armed and clearly in charge. He exchanged a glance with Jack, who nodded grimly. We take them out first, Michael whispered. Without their leaders, the rest will scatter. As they prepared to move, two of Richard's men stepped outside, lighting cigarettes near the entrance. Michael acted instinctively, grabbing a nearby wrench and moving with silent precision. In moments, both were unconscious, their bodies hidden behind a dumpster. Inside, the first shots rang out, shattering the tense quiet. Michael had aimed for the ringleaders, his years of training evident in the accuracy of his fire. Chaos erupted as the remaining men scrambled for cover, yelling orders and firing wildly. Jack covered Michael, his own police training keeping his movements controlled and deliberate. The fight was brutal. Michael's years away from combat hadn't dulled his instincts. He moved like a ghost through the warehouse, using the environment to his advantage. A crowbar became a weapon, crates provided cover, and his unrelenting focus turned the tide in their favor. Jack watched in awe as Michael incapacitated one man after another with calculated precision. But the battle took its toll. A sharp pain shot through Michael's side as a stray bullet grazed him. He gritted his teeth, pressing his hand against the wound to staunch the bleeding. You all right? Jack called out, ducking behind a stack of crates. I'll live, Michael replied, his voice strained. As the dust settled, the remaining men fled, their morale shattered. Michael and Jack stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily. The warehouse was silent except for the occasional groan of the injured. Michael knelt beside one of the ringleaders, who was clutching his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. Tell Richard, Michael said, his voice low and menacing, that I'm not running any more. When they returned to Michael's house, the adrenaline began to wear off, and the weight of their actions set in. Jack shook his head, running a hand through his hair. You're something else, Michael, he said. But that wasn't just instinct back there. That was training. Michael didn't respond immediately. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands still trembling. It's not something I'm proud of, he said finally. But it's the only way to stop him. Jack crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. If you're going to keep fighting, You need to let me in completely. No more half-truths." Before Michael could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think this ends with a warehouse? I'll show you what happens when you challenge me." Attached was another photo, Jessica, taken through the window of her apartment. Michael's grip tightened on the phone, his jaw clenching. "This is just the beginning," he muttered. "Richard wants a war. I'll give him one." Jack placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, a rare show of camaraderie. "Then we fight together. Whatever it takes." As they began planning their next move, Michael felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Hope. For the first time, he wasn't alone in his fight. But he knew the road ahead would be dangerous, and the stakes had never been higher. The Dallas rodeo grounds were alive with energy. Under the glare of floodlights, families cheered for riders, and the scent of popcorn and dust filled the air. It was a perfect setting for a showdown, chaotic, crowded, and full of unsuspecting civilians. For Michael Parker, it was a battleground. Tonight, he would face Richard Klein, not just to protect himself but to ensure no one else paid the price for his past. Michael and Jack arrived early, blending into the crowd. Jack's badge helped them gain access to restricted areas where they could position themselves strategically. The plan was simple: confront Richard during his meeting with local criminals and take him out of the equation for good. But Michael's gut churned with unease. Richard was never one to leave loose ends, and the photo of Jessica still haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger. His fears were confirmed when, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Jessica near the concession stands. She was laughing with a group of friends, oblivious to the danger surrounding her. Michael cursed under his breath. She wasn't supposed to be here. Richard must have known she'd show up, turning the rodeo into his stage. "Jack," Michael said, pulling him aside. "Jessica's here. Richard will use her. We need to move now." Jack nodded, his expression grim. "I'll keep an eye on her. You focus on Richard." The two men split up, Michael heading toward the arena's service entrance where Richard's meeting was set to take place. He moved swiftly but cautiously, his senses heightened. Every shadow seemed to carry a threat, every face a potential enemy. When he reached the service area, he found a group of men gathered around Richard. They were exchanging briefcases, money, weapons, or worse, Michael guessed. Richard stood at the center, commanding the scene with his usual smug authority. But as Michael prepared to make his move, Richard's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. "Spectre, I knew you wouldn't miss this party." The men turned, pulling weapons from their jackets. Michael stepped out of the shadows, his expression cold and unreadable. "Let her go, Richard," he said evenly. Richard smirked, gesturing toward the arena entrance where two of his men appeared, dragging a struggling Jessica into view. Her fear-stricken face was like a dagger to Michael's chest. "Let her go," Richard repeated, laughing. "You don't get to make demands, Spectre. This is my game, and you're playing by my rules." Michael's mind raced. Richard had the upper hand, but the chaos of the rodeo provided opportunities. The crowd was a double-edged sword, both a distraction and a liability. Any misstep could put countless lives at risk. "Fine," Michael said, raising his hands slowly. "You win. Just let her go, and I'll come quietly." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Oh, Michael, you think I don't know you better than that? Drop the act." As if on cue, Jack burst into the scene from a side door, firing a warning shot into the air. The commotion sent Richard's men scattering, and the arena erupted into chaos. Spectators screamed, and the sound of running footsteps echoed through the hallways. Michael used the distraction to lunge at one of the men holding Jessica, disarming him with a swift blow to the wrist. He spun, using the man as a shield as gunfire erupted. Jack fired from his position, keeping the others pinned down. The fight was brutal and close quarters, with punches and gunshots punctuating the din of the fleeing crowd. Richard, however, remained calm, retreating toward the shadows with Jessica still in his grasp. Michael saw red. He couldn't let Richard escape. He shoved through the melee, ignoring the sting of a graze as a bullet skimmed his shoulder. His focus was singular. Save Jessica. "Michael," Jack shouted. "Go. I'll handle them." Without hesitation, Michael bolted after Richard, his boots pounding against the arena floor. The chase led them into the heart of the rodeo grounds, where the lights dimmed and the noise of the crowd faded. They were in the livestock pens now, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. Richard shoved Jessica into a small enclosure and turned to face Michael, his face twisted in a mix of anger and amusement. "You always were predictable," he sneered. "Do you think this ends with me?" Michael didn't reply. His breathing was steady, his movements deliberate. He circled Richard like a predator, his eyes flicking between him and Jessica, calculating his next move. "Fine," Richard said, pulling a knife from his belt. "Let's finish this." The fight was raw, a brutal clash of skill and desperation. Richard's strikes were calculated, but Michael's were fueled by years of suppressed rage. The knife slashed through the air, narrowly missing Michael's face as he dodged and countered with a swift punch to Richard's ribs. The two men grappled, their bodies slamming against the wooden rails of the pen. Jessica screamed as Richard managed to pin Michael, pressing the knife dangerously close to his throat. But Michael, with a surge of strength, twisted free, disarming Richard and sending the knife clattering to the ground. Michael's fists rained down, each punch a release of the guilt, anger, and fear that had haunted him for years. Richard tried to fight back, but Michael was relentless. Finally, Richard collapsed, bloodied and gasping for breath. "It's over," Michael said, his voice low but firm. He looked to Jessica, who was huddled in the corner, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." Before Michael could finish tying Richard, Jack appeared, limping but alive. "Cops are on their way," he said, his gaze flicking to Richard. "You good?" Michael nodded, his chest heaving. "It's done." As the police arrived, taking Richard and his remaining men into custody, Michael helped Jessica to her feet. She clung to him, her fear giving way to a fragile sense of relief. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Not yet. There would be time for explanations, time to face the consequences. But for now, the weight of Richard's reign was finally lifted, and for the first time in years, Michael felt something close to peace. The days following Richard's capture were a whirlwind of police investigations and media coverage. Michael Parker kept to the shadows, careful to avoid the cameras and questions that swirled around the incident at the rodeo. For the public, the story was simple. A group of criminals led by Richard Klein had been apprehended in a daring operation, thanks in part to Jack Thompson's heroics. Michael's role was left unspoken, just as he preferred. But his silence did not shield him from the aftermath. Jessica, still shaken by the ordeal, had grown distant. She deserved answers, and Michael knew he couldn't evade her forever. One evening, as the Texas Pride store was closing, Jessica approached him. Her face was a mixture of anger and vulnerability. "Michael, I've been patient, but I need to know. Who are you? What were you doing with people like Richard?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with frustration. Michael sighed, setting aside the broom he'd been using to sweep the floor. The store was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound. "You're right," he said finally. "You deserve the truth." They sat at the counter, the dim light casting long shadows. Michael spoke slowly, his words weighed down by years of pain. He told Jessica about Phoenix, about growing up in the shadow of poverty and violence. He explained how Richard had preyed on his desperation, molding him into a tool for destruction. He didn't spare himself in the story, admitting to the things he had done, the lives he had taken, and the guilt that followed him like a specter. When he finished, Jessica sat in silence. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup. "You were just a kid," she said softly. "But that doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't erase what I saw." Michael nodded. "I know. That's why I tried to leave it all behind. To start over." Jessica's gaze was piercing. "And what now? Are you just going to disappear again? Hide from the people who care about you?" Her words struck a nerve. Michael had spent so long running, from Richard, from his past, from himself, that he hadn't considered what staying might mean. For the first time, he realized that redemption wasn't just about leaving his old life behind, it was about building something better. Jack, meanwhile, had become a constant presence in Michael's life. The two men shared an unspoken bond forged in the chaos of battle. Jack, though wary, respected Michael's skills and determination. One afternoon, as they sat in a local diner, Jack slid a folder across the table. "What's this?" Michael asked, eyeing the folder suspiciously. "An opportunity," Jack replied. "There's a community program for at-risk kids. They need someone to teach self-defense, someone who knows what it's like to face real danger." Michael hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the folder. "Jack, I'm not exactly a role model." Jack smirked. "Maybe not. But you know how to fight, and you know how to survive. These kids could use someone like you." Michael opened the folder, flipping through the pages. The program was modest, small classes held in a rundown gym, but the potential was clear. He saw faces that reminded him of his own at that age. Kids with nowhere to go, looking for someone to believe in them. "All right," Michael said quietly. "I'll give it a shot." The first class was awkward. Michael stood in front of a group of skeptical teenagers, their eyes filled with mistrust. He felt out of place, unsure of how to connect. But as he demonstrated techniques and shared stories, carefully omitting the darkest parts, something shifted. The kids began to engage, asking questions, testing their limits. By the end of the session, a few even stayed behind to thank him. Over time, the classes became a cornerstone of Michael's new life. Teaching wasn't just about self-defense, it was about discipline, respect, and self-worth. Michael saw the changes in his students, the way they carried themselves, the way they looked at the world, and felt a glimmer of hope. If he could help even one of them avoid the path he had taken, it would be worth it. Jessica, too, found herself drawn back to Michael. She saw the effort he was putting into rebuilding his life, the way he threw himself into the community. Slowly, their friendship began to heal. One evening, as they closed up the store together, Jessica turned to him with a small smile. "You know," she said, "you're not the same man I met a year ago." Michael chuckled softly. "That's the idea." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then Jessica spoke again, her voice steady. "You're trying, Michael. And that matters." Michael also started participating in local events, using the store as a hub for community initiatives. He organized fundraisers, sponsored rodeo competitions, and created safe spaces for young people. The once quiet clerk was becoming a fixture in the community, someone people trusted and admired. But despite the progress, Michael couldn't fully escape his past. Nightmares still visited him, and the scars on his body were constant reminders of what he had done. One evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, he stared at a photo of Jason, the friend he had been forced to kill. "I'm sorry," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm trying to make it right." Months passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm. Michael was no longer just surviving, he was living. But he knew his redemption would always be a work in progress. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was his to shape. At a community event held at the store, Michael watched as his students performed a self-defense demonstration. Jessica stood beside him, her smile warm and genuine. Jack leaned against a nearby post, his ever-watchful eyes scanning the crowd. For the first time in years, Michael felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: peace. As the event wound down, Jessica placed a hand on his arm. "Michael," she said, her voice gentle, "you can't change the past. But you've shown me, and this whole town, that you're not the man you used to be. You're better." Michael looked out at the crowd, at the young faces filled with hope and determination. He nodded slowly. "I just hope I can keep proving it." "You will," Jessica said. "You already have." And for the first time, Michael allowed himself to believe it. Months after the chaotic showdown at the rodeo, the world seemed calmer for Michael Parker. The trial of Richard Klein had concluded with a lifetime sentence for the man who had built an empire of fear. His criminal network was dismantled, his influence reduced to whispers. For most, it was the end of a nightmare. For Michael, it was a chance to breathe, though not without cost. The courtroom had been a quiet battlefield. Michael watched from the back row as prosecutors laid bare Richard's crimes. Witnesses recounted horrors that mirrored Michael's past, but he stayed silent, unwilling to let his old identity resurface. Jack Thompson had taken center stage during the trial, his testimony pivotal in securing Richard's fate. When the verdict was read, a wave of relief swept over the courtroom. Michael slipped out unnoticed, choosing to leave the applause and recognition to others. Life in Dallas continued to shift. At Texas Pride, Michael and Jessica worked tirelessly to rebuild what the past months had shaken. The store had become more than a business. It was a symbol of resilience. Jessica's leadership and warmth brought in new customers, while Michael's quiet dedication drew people back time and again. Together, they planned an expansion, opening a second location in a neighboring town. One evening, as they worked late on inventory, Jessica paused, leaning against the counter. "You ever think about the future, Michael?" she asked, her tone casual but her eyes searching. Michael looked up from his clipboard, a faint smile touching his lips. "I've spent so much time thinking about the past, I'm not sure I know how to." Jessica chuckled softly. "Well, maybe it's time to start. You've got more going for you than you think." Michael didn't respond immediately. He glanced around the store, at the life he had carved out from the ruins of his past. For the first time, the idea of a future didn't feel so foreign. Jack had become a regular visitor, though he often joked that he came for the free coffee rather than Michael's company. One afternoon, as they stood outside the store, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jack turned to Michael with a smirk. "So, what now, cowboy? You've cleaned up your act. Gonna ride off into the sunset?" Michael laughed, shaking his head. "I think I've had enough running. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on you." Jack's expression grew serious. "You've come a long way, Michael. But you know this isn't the end. You've got people here who care about you. Don't mess it up." "I don't plan to," Michael replied, his voice steady. Michael's classes at the community center became more than a routine. They became his purpose. The teenagers he trained weren't just students. They were reflections of who he had once been. He pushed them to be stronger, not just physically, but mentally. His lessons were peppered with reminders of the choices they had. Violence isn't strength. Walking away is. One evening, after class, a young boy named Aaron lingered behind. He was small for his age, with a mop of unruly hair and a shy demeanor. "Mr. Parker?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Michael knelt to meet his gaze. "What's on your mind, Aaron?" The boy fidgeted, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack. "Do you ever regret things?" Michael's chest tightened. He placed a reassuring hand on Aaron's shoulder. "Every day. But regret doesn't have to hold you back. It can push you to be better." Aaron nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Thanks, Mr. Parker." As Aaron left, Michael felt a pang of emotion. In that moment, he realized how much he had gained by staying. These connections, these moments, they were his redemption. The rodeo arena, once a site of violence, now hosted an annual community event organized by Michael, Jessica, and Jack. It was a celebration of resilience, drawing families from all over Dallas. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and the laughter of children echoed across the grounds. Michael stood near the entrance, watching as his students demonstrated self-defense techniques for an enthusiastic crowd. Jessica approached, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "You're not just watching, are you?" she teased, handing him a cup. Michael took it with a grateful nod. "Just making sure everything goes smoothly." Jessica tilted her head, her expression softening. "You know, you've done something amazing here." "It wasn't just me," Michael replied. "You, Jack, this whole community. You all made it possible." Jessica's hand brushed his arm. "But it started with you. Don't forget that." As the event wound down, Michael found himself standing alone, watching the horizon. The night was quiet, the chaos of his past feeling like a distant memory. Jack joined him, his usual smirk replaced by a contemplative look. "You're different," Jack said. "Not just from when we met. You're different from who you were even a month ago." Michael smiled faintly. "It's not easy, you know, letting go of what I've done. But I'm starting to see there's more to life than running or fighting." Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Damn right there is. And don't forget, you've got people who've got your back now." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. "I know. And I won't take that for granted." In the quiet of his small apartment, Michael sat with an old photo of Jason. The guilt still lingered, but it no longer consumed him. He set the photo aside and pulled out a notebook filled with ideas for his classes and plans for the new store. For the first time in years, Michael felt at peace with the man he was becoming. His past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. As he closed the notebook, he whispered into the stillness, "I'm not done yet." And with that, Michael Parker stepped into his new life, one choice at a time. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.